Sin and redemption. Simeon had dreaded this day. Despite actively heading towards it for the last 6 years, now it had finally arrived. He couldn't shake the nausea in his stomach. Returning to his home planet felt strange. So much had changed, yet the world still clung to the past. A strange fusion of the old world technology he remembered and a new, advanced yet minimalist architectural design. Influences from every culture were present: bodegas, noodle stalls, pubs, and restaurants serving everything from Creole, French, Greek, and American cuisine added personality to the constructivist architecture. The garish lights of the city illuminated its bustling streets, packed with leisurely shoppers and haggard worker bees heading home. The skies were packed with hovercrafts, with both residential and public transportation vehicles locked in a never-ending traffic jam. Neon advertisements riddled the cityscape, and yet the patriotic slogans fixed to the sides of buildings and the infrequent patrols of heavily armored soldiers hinted that beyond the teeming metropolis and the mundane lives of its denizens, an intergalactic war was raging. He glanced at Allie. She was standing next to him, her hood pulled up to combat the drizzling rain so he couldn't see her face clearly. But from what he could see, he could tell she was apprehensive. She was nervously chewing her bottom lip. He reached down and squeezed her hand paternally. "This is for the best, Allie," he said, nodding firmly as if to convince himself as well as her. She looked at him then. Her eyes were both reproachful and pleading. "I'd rather stay with you," she said, squeezing his hand the way she used to when she was a child. "I don't know these people." "They're your family, Allie," Simeon said. "You still need a legal guardian. They'll look after you. They'll be thrilled to see you're alive." She looked as though she was about to say more, revisit the old argument. Instead, she dropped her eyes and withdrew her hand from his. For 6 years, he had been like a father to her. He had watched her grow from a small child to a teenager. Soon, he would be forced to say goodbye to her forever. They entered the apartment block, and after a brief inquiry at the front desk, the robotic concierge directed them to a rundown elevator. The rickety ascent reminded them of their time in space transit. Huddled in cargo holds filled with crates or strapped into seats, with the heavy belts and tangled webbing of transport ships as they made the long journey back to Earth. The thought upset both of them, and they stood apart from each other in a tense silence. It was another reminder of what they'd be leaving behind. Despite the tribulations, they'd always been together. At last, the elevator doors grinded laboriously open, and they walked down a corridor strewn with graffiti and smelling of stale urine. They made their way to a door with the number 649 highlighted in flickering LED lights on a dim screen. Simeon let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and rang the doorbell. After a moment, the door slid open, and a woman in her mid-late 40s peered questioningly at them. Although she had a thin, severe face, she was nevertheless an attractive woman. The woman looked at Simeon expectantly for a moment before noticing Allie. She went pale. Then she let out a little scream before embracing Allie tearfully. Allie hesitated, unable to stop herself from flinching. Then she leaned awkwardly into the hug and returned the embrace. "It is you, isn't it, Allison?" she cried, holding Allie at arm's length to get a better look at her. Allie stood stiffly, not sure how to react. "I'm guessing you're Margaret?" she asked stiffly. "Yeah, I'm Allison. Nice to meet you, Aunt Margaret. Your parents? Are they—" Margaret cast a questioning glance towards Simeon, no doubt wondering why a stranger was with her niece. "They're gone," Allie said shortly. "Simeon's been looking after me." "I see," Margaret said, eyeing Simeon suspiciously. "Well, you'd better come in." She stepped aside, beckoning them to enter. Simeon had intended to leave straight away after reuniting Allie with her family. However, Margaret clearly had questions, and Allie looked extremely uncomfortable, so he followed them into the apartment. The apartment was fastidiously tidy, but the furniture was old and faded. A delicious smell wafted from the small kitchen. A Maine Coon cat, whether it was real or cybernetic was impossible to tell, was curled up on the sofa. It paused in the act of cleaning its luxurious fur and raised its large head to fix the visitors with a penetrating stare. In the living room, there sat an old woman. She seemed to sink into her chair. Her back was hunched with age, and her legs seemed to hang limply over the edge of the armchair. Her eyes were hollow, her cheeks sunken, and her paper-thin skin was blotched with liver spots and a spider's web of blue veins. She stared at the newcomers with confused, watery eyes. "Alice," the old woman said in a quavering voice, "is that you?" "No, Mother," Margaret said gently, crossing the room to stand beside her, while Simeon and Allie hung up their wet coats. "This is Allison, Hugh and Alice's daughter. Your granddaughter is alive." The old woman shakily turned her head from Margaret to look closely at Allie. "I have a granddaughter," she said, a statement rather than a question. "And her name is Allison." "Grandma Ruby," Allie said, fidgeting nervously. "It's nice to meet you. Mum talked a lot about you, both of you," she added hastily, including Margaret with a polite glance. "It took a while to track you down," Simeon said, almost standing to attention as if he was back in the army. "I promised Allie I'd reunite her with her family." Margaret narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips. "We're grateful, but I think you've done enough." Allie shot a surprised glance at her. Simeon felt a knot of dread in his stomach, and his expression looked strained. Margaret was running her eyes over his jacket coldly. Her suspicion had deepened, and her posture was rigid. Why would an Aurelian soldier help an Earth girl? Simeon swallowed, inwardly berating himself for not leaving his outer coat on. He had ripped away all the identifiable pieces that marked him as an Aurelian soldier, but the fit was very distinctive. He stepped forward, surreptitiously raising a hand to quiet Allie, who looked defensive. He took a breath to steady himself. "Then let me explain. It's a long story." Simeon hadn't been born on the planet of Auralia, though years later he would adopt it as his home. He was a native of the United European Alliance and had been born and raised in Neo-Paris in the Jewish Quarter. He'd had a troubled youth and a strained relationship with his parents. After a few incidents involving petty crimes, his father had forced him to enlist in the army, convinced it would keep him out of trouble. His father couldn't have known war would break out a few years later. His only intention had been to curtail Simeon's behavior before his crimes devolved into something more serious that risked a potential jail sentence. Simeon would never see his parents again after enlisting, much to the regret of both parties. Auralia was one of the many human settlements formed as Earth began to colonize the galaxy. An alien species had once ruled over it before, but were long extinct by the time Simeon and the rest of his battalion were sent there. Auralia was a Dyson sphere, a vast expanse of solar panels that encircled a star, and was a key source of fuel for starships traveling further into space. On each panel were cities the size of continents, a hybrid of human technology and that of the alien race who had once inhabited them. Like so many other human settlements, the citizens of Auralia had grown tired of Earth's heavy taxation laws and declared themselves a republic. This had sparked a siege war of epic proportions. Though some food sources and materials were grown on Auralia, the Auralians mostly relied on imported goods from neighboring planets. It was a war of attrition. The forces of Earth slowly chipped away at Auralia's defenses, knowing that time and numbers were on their side. By the time Simeon made planetfall, the Republic had been reduced to cells of freedom, fighters scattered over different regions, disrupting fuel stations and attacking key military strongholds claimed by Earth soldiers. Feeling sympathetic to the Auralians' plight, Simeon had defected to their side about 6 months into his military service. It had taken him time to gain the trust of his new comrades. Spies were constantly attempting to sow conflict among the rebels. But in time, he was accepted. He'd even had a short-termed, ill-fated romance with a fellow rebel named Dakarai. Then came the day that would upend his life once again. The rebels had attacked a small base near the outskirts of a power plant. There was a smaller military presence at that base, with the greater numbers concentrated closer to the plant itself, comprised of mostly civilians, making them a vulnerable target. The rebels had struck quickly. The aim was to cause as much destruction as possible before reinforcements arrived. The surprise attack had been a success, and the base had fallen in just under an hour. Simeon had been among the number that engaged with the small military force. He had no qualms about killing other soldiers. That was part of the job. But when the rebels began rounding up the civilians, he'd felt a nagging unease at the back of his mind. Impromptu firing squads were formed, and the civilians were gunned down wholesale. The small buildings were torched or bombed. The final straw for Simeon had been when a fellow rebel soldier had stormed into a nursery with a flamethrower, and before long there were infantile screams and pleas for mercy. Even among the civilians that had died by firing squad, there were a depressing number of adolescent bodies. Bodies riddled to pulp by bullets. Burnt bodies twisted grotesquely as the heat of the fires contorted their tendons and ligaments. The smell of seared metal, blood, and cooked flesh. Simeon's mind broke and he ran. He didn't run far. He just wanted to get away from the flames. He wandered for a while until his steps took him to the destroyed bridge leading to the power plant. It had been one of the first structures destroyed in the attack, an essential part of the plan to delay enemy reinforcements. Below him was a yawning ravine, so deep the bottom was shrouded in darkness. For what seemed like an eternity, he just stood there. What was he doing? He had never doubted until then that changing sides and joining the rebels had been the right thing to do. Despite his rebellious youth, Simeon was a very moral man. Auralia was being persecuted, and he had never doubted switching sides was anything other than morally justified. Then he thought of the carnage he'd just fled from. Bile rose in his throat, and he pitched forward and vomited into the abyss. Tears and mucus streamed down his face, and his limbs trembled uncontrollably. He could still hear the screams. Whether they were real or the lingering echoes from memory, he couldn't say. On an impulse, he climbed onto the ledge of the bridge. He stared down at the immense blackness. All his moral grandstanding seemed absurd to him now. In that moment, the abyss was the most inviting sight in the world. A small noise to the right of him penetrated his thoughts. Despite his desire to end it all, his training took over and he turned sharply, raising his rifle to his shoulder and cocking it. A small girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, was hidden by a mound of rubble and scattered debris. The body of a soldier was slumped protectively over her. The man had been shot in the stomach and had clearly succumbed to his wounds. His body, rather than shielding the girl, was now slowly crushing her. The soldier's innards were spilling out onto the ground, and blood was seeping into the earth around him. The girl had been trying to quietly push the body off her without alerting Simeon, but the dead weight and her own muffled sobs were causing her difficulty to breathe. Her eyes met Simeon's, and he quickly lowered his weapon. He climbed off the ledge and hurried to help her. She panicked. She wept and pleaded as he approached. He hauled the body off her, and she shrank away from him with her arms flung out defensively. "It's all right," he said, shifting the rifle on its strap behind his back and out of sight. "I'm not going to hurt you." She looked up at his tear-stained face in confusion. He looked down at the body. Who was he? "He's my dad," the girl said. Her voice was so tiny. She looked at her father, then at Simeon, hatred now mixed with her fear. "You killed my mum and dad," she wailed, breaking down and sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," Simeon said, his own voice breaking. "I'm really, really sorry." His words sounded ridiculously hollow, yet it was all he could think to say. A footstep behind him made Simeon turn. 2 rebel soldiers were striding towards them. From their position, the girl was hidden behind the rubble, but it would only be a matter of time before she came into view. "What are you doing?" one of them called to Simeon. Then they saw the dead soldier and grinned. "Made a run for it, did he?" the other asked with a chuckle. Then they saw the girl. The first man looked a little surprised, but the second man's grin widened. He casually reached for the pistol holstered on his belt, his eyes fixed on the girl's horror-stricken face. In that moment, clarity seemed to settle on Simeon's mind, calming his thoughts and steadying his shaking hands. He dropped to one knee, bringing his rifle up in one fluid motion, and squeezed the trigger. The man was blown off his feet, his ribcage obliterated. The girl screamed. The remaining soldier swore in startled surprise, fumbling for his own weapon in a panic. Simeon took him down with a quick burst of gunfire, the bullets making a bloody trail from the chest to the head as the rifle recoiled. Quickly he checked they were dead. He heard distant shouts and knew they only had a few minutes before someone else came to investigate. After confirming the kill, he hurried back to the girl. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with shock. "Come with me," Simeon said urgently. "We need to leave." "You killed them." "I know," Simeon said. "They were going to kill you. Now let's go." The girl was still gibbering with shock. Simeon forced himself to calm down. "What's your name?" "Allie," the girl said shakily. Simeon nodded. He reached down to her father's collar and pulled a set of dog tags from about his neck and handed them to Allie. "I'm sorry we don't have time to bury him," Simeon said. "But if we don't leave now, we'll both be killed. Your dad died protecting you. Don't let that go to waste." He took her hand and hauled her to her feet. She flinched at his touch. Then she looked down at the dog tags in her hand, and then at her father. She took an unsteady breath, closing her small fist around the dog tags. She had come to a decision. She didn't struggle as Simeon picked her up, cradling her in his left arm while he held his rifle under his right. Then he began to run. "What's your name?" Allie asked suddenly. "It's Simeon." "After that," Simeon concluded, "I managed to smuggle us off-planet with the help of a few contacts before my desertion became widely known. We've spent the last 6 years hitchhiking our way back to Earth." Margaret and Ruby were silent for a while. Allie was watching them closely, standing protectively by Simeon's side. "That's quite a story," Margaret said coldly. "I don't know how reliable the word of a man who admits to regularly switching sides is, but we're grateful Allison is safe. But my sister is still dead. How many other families have you ruined? How many children have you killed before deciding Allison was one too many?" "That's not what happened," Allie said hotly. Simeon lowered his eyes and Margaret looked at her sympathetically. "You were 9 years old," she said kindly. "You've been under his control and he's had 6 years to manipulate you. I also have to wonder," now she glared at Simeon, "what your relationship to my niece was for all those years. 6 years is a long time for a man to travel alone with a young girl." Allie looked enraged, but Simeon raised a placating hand. "Yes," Margaret said, noticing the gesture. "Why don't you answer the question?" "I understand your skepticism," Simeon said reasonably. "Allie and I traveled as father and daughter to avoid suspicion. Our relationship in private was the same as our disguised one. Nothing inappropriate happened." "I see." Margaret still didn't look completely convinced, but was mollified enough to drop the topic. "As for the attack that killed Allie's parents," Simeon continued, "I can't make any excuses for what happened. I've always tried to do the right thing, or at least live by my conscience. But when all's said and done, I'm a traitor. I abandoned my duties to both sides. Not exactly role model material. Call it selfishness, but I just wanted to do something right for once. So, I brought Allie home. What will you do now? Asked Ruby. I don't know, Simeon confessed. I can't stay here on Earth. Allie looked at him despairingly, her eyes filling with tears. I'm sorry, Simeon said, his voice cracking slightly. I've no living family left here, and besides, I'm a deserter and a wanted man. The longer I stay here, the riskier it is. Ruby began to rise slowly from her chair. Margaret looked startled. Mother? She gasped. Ruby took her daughter's arm to steady herself and walked over to Simeon. She stood in front of him and looked him full in the face. She studied his expression for a moment, then patted him on the arm with a bony hand. It's not easy to see a man wearing the uniform of those who killed my daughter and my son-in-law, she said. I still grieve, even after all these years. Do you know what the worst thing is? He shook his head. The worst thing is that sometimes I'll try to remember their faces, and I can't. Not always, anyway. It's a terrifying thing to slowly lose your memory. Pieces of you slowly fall away, and you don't even realize it. But when I look at Allison, here she beamed at her granddaughter, I can see their faces clearly. I don't know much about you, Simon, but I'm grateful to you for that. Simeon smiled, ignoring her mispronunciation of his name. Thank you. He turned to Allie. Take care of yourself, Allie. She enveloped him in a hug. He could feel her sobbing against his chest. You don't have to go, she said. It was one last vain attempt. I have to, Allie, Simeon said softly. She let go and rummaged in her pocket before taking out her father's dog tags. She handed them to Simeon. You'll always be family. Never forget me, okay? She said, forcing herself to smile. He returned the smile and gently brushed the tears away from her cheeks. I never could, he said. He grabbed his coat and made for the door. Simeon, Margaret called after him. He paused. Thank you. I really am thankful you brought Allison home. Simeon looked at her. Though her expression was still severe, the gratitude in her eyes was genuine. He nodded, and after one last look at Allie, he left. It was still raining when he left the apartment building. Simeon looked around him at the people as they went about their business, feeling a sense of detachment. He didn't fit in here. He was out of place, a spare cog without a function. Then he looked at the dog tags in his hand, and with a feeling of renewed strength, set off into the evening gloom.